On a December night in 1992, in a little apartment in a tiny Texas town called Mansfield, a 16-year-old girl named Marie Robards sat down at the dinner table. After taking her seat, Marie looked across the table and almost started laughing at her father, Stephen. Stephen, who was 38 years old and delivered mail for a living, was 6 foot 4 inches tall with long legs and long arms, and so him trying to sit at their little kitchen table made him look like a giant trying to sit at a kid's table. Stephen saw Marie smiling at him, and he smiled back, and then the two of them sniffed the air and exchanged excited looks. Stephen barely ever cooked, so he and Marie rarely sat down at the dinner table to eat together, but tonight was going to be different. Recently, Stephen had started dating a new woman who lived in the same apartment complex as he and Marie. Her name was Sandra Hudgens, and she loved to cook, and tonight, that was what she was doing. And her Mexican feast she was preparing was filling the apartment with delicious smells. As Sandra stood over the stove seasoning tacos, rice, and refried beans, Marie began telling her father about her day at school. She said all of her classes were interesting and going well, but chemistry was her favorite class. In fact, she said she loved science in general so much that she had started thinking about going into a pre-med program when she went to college in a couple of years so she could become a doctor. Stephen knew Marie could become a doctor if she wanted to, or really anything else she set her mind to. His daughter was intelligent, beautiful, charismatic, and a highly disciplined student. So much so that on the weekends, Marie often stayed in and just did schoolwork while most of her friends and peers were out and having fun and partying. And while this certainly made Stephen very proud of his daughter that she was so studious, secretly, Stephen sometimes wished that Marie would step away from her schoolwork even for a day and just go out and be a teenager and have some fun. And lately, given what Marie was going through with her mother and Stephen's ex-wife, this secret wish of his was all Stephen thought about when he looked at his daughter. Up until just a few months earlier, Marie had been living with her mother, Beth, and her stepfather, Frank, in a nearby town. Marie and her mom had always been incredibly close. Marie often said her mom was her best friend. But Marie's stepfather was a police officer who took discipline and rules very seriously, and so he was quite strict with Marie, which often caused the two of them to argue and created a lot of tension in their household. And their living situation got infinitely worse when Marie walked in on Frank in bed with another woman. Marie already did not like Frank, but now she hated him. However, when she went to her mom and told her what she had discovered about Frank, her mom, who was crushed by the news, no doubt, still said she would not be leaving Frank. This caused a huge fight between Marie and her mom, which ended with Marie moving out of the house and into her father's apartment. Stephen was overjoyed to have his daughter living with him, but at the same time, he knew this was not really a happy arrangement. Ultimately, he knew his daughter just really felt hurt by her mother and longed for things to go back to the way they were when she and her mom were just best friends. In the kitchen, Sandra announced that dinner was ready, and she turned away from the stove and began walking over to the dinner table, her hands full of serving dishes. And right as Marie got up to help Sandra put the food on the table, the landline telephone rang in the living room. They all looked at each other to see who was going to go pick it up, and Marie said she would, and that she would tell whoever was calling that they were in the middle of dinner and they should just call back. But a few moments later, when Stephen and Sandra heard Marie answer the phone in the other room, they heard Marie start yelling at whoever was calling. And after a few moments, even though they couldn't quite tell what Marie and this other person were actually yelling about, it became clear that the other person that she was talking to had to be her mother. Eventually, Marie slammed the phone down and stormed back into the kitchen, her face bright red and her hands shaking. Stephen asked her if she was okay and, what's wrong, but Marie just took a deep breath and suddenly a calm look came over her face and she just said, "I don't want to talk about it." And after a quick glance at each other, Stephen and Sandra simply nodded, and then before long, the trio was back to chatting about Marie's schoolwork and her college aspirations. But as much as Marie wished that big yelling fight she got into with her mother could just fade out of everyone's mind, it couldn't. Because over the next couple of months, Marie and her mother would get into more and more of these types of yelling fights on the phone. And Stephen and Sandra, who often overheard these fights, would always ask Marie afterward what was wrong and was everything okay. but Marie would just continue to ask for privacy and demand they not talk about it. And for the most part, Stephen and Sandra did just that. They rarely pried and instead just kept an eye on Marie, hoping that someday soon the fighting with her mother would just stop. And by the middle of February of 1993, so 2 months after that first yelling fight Marie got into with her mom, it seemed like that was exactly what had happened, because the angry phone calls stopped, and Marie seemed happier and somewhat back to normal. But beneath the surface, something else entirely was going on. On the night of February 18th, so right around the time that the yelling phone fights stopped between Marie and her mom, Marie was home alone at the apartment, sitting on the couch reading from one of her science textbooks. Her father, Stephen, was out at church, and Stephen's girlfriend, Sandra, was at her own apartment nearby. As Marie flipped through the pages, she heard something bang against the front door. She wasn't sure if someone had knocked, or if maybe someone had accidentally hit the outside of their door, and so Marie just sat there for a second staring at the door, wondering if the knocking sound would start again, and after a few seconds, she heard it again. Marie glanced at her watch and saw that her father had only left about 45 minutes earlier, and normally he would stay at church for hours at a time, so this likely was not him, and Sandra was not scheduled to come by that night, so it likely was not her either. Marie waited a moment, and when she heard yet another bang, she called out to see who was there, but no one answered. After a few more moments of silence, Marie stood up and began walking over to the door, but before she could get there, the front door suddenly flew open, and her father stumbled inside, and he looked absolutely terrible. His face was pale, and even though it was cold outside, there was sweat dripping down his forehead, and his dress shirt was also drenched in sweat. Marie frantically began asking her dad what was wrong, what was going on, but all Stephen could get out was that he needed to lay down. So Marie rushed over and helped her enormous father stumble across the room until he kind of collapsed on the couch. And then once he was lying down, Marie, who was really starting to panic, told her father she was going to get Sandra and she'd be right back. And so a moment later, Marie had run out the front door into the cold night air, and she charged across the parking lot over to the row of apartments where Sandra lived, and then once she found Sandra's door, she began pounding on it. When Sandra flung the door open, wondering what was going on, Marie quickly explained that her father was very sick and they needed to do something, and so without asking any more questions, Sandra just ran with Marie back to the apartment. When they got there, they found Stephen still lying on the couch, but he was borderline unresponsive and looking much more pale than when Marie had left him. Sandra had no idea what was going on, but she knew whatever this was, it was bad, and so she rushed into the living room, she picked up the phone, and she dialed 911. The paramedics would arrive just a few minutes later, but it was already too late. Stephen had died. Shortly after his death, the coroner would conduct an autopsy and conclude that Stephen had died from a heart attack. After her father's death, Marie, who was totally crushed, moved back in with her mother, Beth, and her stepfather, Frank. Even though Marie and her mother had stopped fighting, their relationship was by no means fixed, and Marie still hated Frank. But Beth promised Marie that things would be different this time around, and true to her word, Beth made a real effort to spend as much time as she could with Marie, just like the old days. And for a time, despite the tragic loss of her father, Marie was basically happy. But in the summer of 1993, a few months after Stephen died, Marie discovered a note that another woman had written to Frank, and based on that note, it was obvious to Marie that Frank was still cheating on her mother. But again, when Marie brought this note to her mother and pleaded with her to leave Frank and for them to just go live by themselves somewhere else, Marie's mother refused and said she would not be leaving Frank no matter what. And when she said that, Marie felt like her mother had turned her back on her and was choosing Frank over her own daughter. As such, Marie decided that she could not bear to live with either of them anymore. So in June, just 4 months after Marie had moved back in with her mom, Marie moved out again, this time to live with her grandfather, who lived in Mansfield, the same town where Stephen's apartment had been. Right away, Marie felt totally relieved to be away from all the drama surrounding her mother and Frank. And not long after moving in with her grandfather, Marie's senior year of high school began, and quickly, Marie was fully immersed in her schoolwork and spending almost no time worrying about all the issues in her family. Marie also began going out and seeing friends on the weekends, just like her father had always secretly hoped she would. But as happy and normal as Marie seemed, beneath the surface, this was not true. Because Marie had a secret that she was now starting to struggle to contain. One afternoon in January of 1994, almost a year after Stephen's death and 6 months after Marie had moved in with her grandfather, Marie and one of her friends went back to Marie's grandfather's house to study after school. The two girls walked into Marie's bedroom, took off their winter coats, tossed their backpacks on the floor, and then, after talking for a few minutes about school and what they wanted to do that weekend, they both decided it was time to actually start studying. And so Marie and her friend both sat down on the floor, they unzipped their backpacks, and took out their copies of Hamlet that they were reading for their English class. Hamlet is a very famous play by William Shakespeare that tells the story of a Danish prince whose father, the king, has died. Marie and her friend discussed the plot and the characters of Hamlet, and then Marie's friend said she wanted to read out loud one of her favorite parts of the play. So she flipped through her book and found the section she was looking for, and then Marie's friend held her book up in front of her face, cleared her throat, and started reading that section out loud. Marie's friend read a part of a very intense scene where one of the characters reveals a secret he's kept throughout the play. "O wretched state, O bosom black as death," the character cries out to make it clear how upset he is about this secret. Marie listened to her friend read this part, and all of a sudden, she began feeling this pit in her stomach forming. Marie's hands started to tremble, she felt a lump growing in her throat, and then she just started sobbing. Her friend who was reading was stunned, and she stopped reading mid-sentence and asked Marie what was wrong. Marie struggled to catch her breath. Then she wiped the tears from her eyes, and she looked up, and through a cracking voice, she told her friend that, like the character in the play, she too had a secret that she had never told anyone, but now she had to get it off her chest. Marie's friend was stunned at this revelation, but quickly told Marie that she could trust her, and that whatever the secret was, she was sure Marie would be okay, that they could figure out what to do together. But when Marie actually began telling the friend what this secret was, the friend's face went pale and her mouth opened in horror. Marie's secret, which had to do with her deceased father, was way bigger than the friend had anticipated. And if this was true, and the friend told anyone about it, it would make headlines around the country. Based on this wild secret story that Marie would tell her friend, and on later interviews conducted with Marie and Stephen's friends and family, here is a reconstruction of what happened the night Stephen Robards died in his apartment on February 18th, 1993. On February 18th, about an hour before Stephen left for church, a delivery person arrived at Stephen and Marie's apartment with the takeout Mexican food Stephen had ordered for dinner. After paying the delivery person, Stephen put the containers of food on the kitchen counter so Marie could begin eating, while Stephen stepped into the other room to get dressed for church. When he came back out again, he wolfed down a plate of food, gave Marie a kiss and said goodbye, and then headed out the door for the night. Once outside, Stephen got into his car and made the short drive to the church he attended in his neighborhood. He was in a great mood because he always looked forward to weeknight services. There was usually a smaller crowd than on Sundays, so it was easier for him to talk to friends and share in the community experience the church had to offer. When Stephen finally arrived at the church, he stepped out of his car and began walking towards the entrance. Even though it was a cold winter night for North Texas, with temperatures lower than 40 degrees Fahrenheit, Stephen felt warm, and sweat was starting to bead on his forehead. But he just wiped the sweat away and didn't think too much about it. Stephen walked inside the church, took off his coat, and began chatting with other members of the congregation who were standing near the front door greeting new arrivals. A few moments later, Stephen had left the front entryway and made his way to a seat in one of the church's long wooden pews. Shortly after that, as the minister took his place in front of the congregation and got ready to begin the service, Stephen's vision began to blur. He felt sweat dripping down his forehead again, and now he was having a hard time focusing, like he was overtired or something. But Stephen just continued to wipe the sweat away and told himself everything was fine. But just a few moments later, he began to feel a sharp pain in his stomach. Stephen winced and grabbed at his midsection and bent over in the pew. The people sitting next to him looked worried and asked if Stephen needed any help. He told them he was okay through gritted teeth, but as he did, he started to feel nauseous, and so quickly he stood up, apologized to the people sitting next to him, and he hustled out of the row and out of the church as fast as he could. Once outside, Stephen felt the cold air hit his skin, but he was still burning up and sweating profusely. The pain in his stomach was getting worse too, but he managed to not throw up and got into his car, turned it on, and began driving out of the lot back towards home. By the time Stephen pulled into a parking spot in front of his apartment, the pain in his stomach had gotten exponentially worse, and now, on top of everything else, he was struggling to breathe. He managed to get his car door open, and he groaned in pain as he stumbled to the front door of his apartment. His hands were shaking as he raised his keys up to the lock and tried to unlock the door, but he couldn't get the keys to fit in, and he sort of fell forward and slammed against the outside of the door. This was the first loud thumping sound that his daughter would hear inside as she studied her science textbook. Stephen took a breath and then managed to get the keys into the lock and open the door, stumbling inside practically onto Marie. Marie helped him lay down on the couch, and then she ran off to get Sandra. Meanwhile, Stephen's throat began tightening up like he was being choked. And while Stephen lay alone on the couch waiting for Marie and Sandra to return, he began to convulse and foam at the mouth. And when Sandra and Marie did return to the apartment, Stephen was no longer responsive, and a few minutes later, when paramedics arrived, it was obvious to everyone in the room that Stephen was just getting worse. And so Sandra, sensing this, grabbed Marie and pressed her face into her chest so Marie would not have to see her father die. Stephen then made one final gasping sound, and then he would die. As Sandra began to cry, Marie pulled herself away from her and just stood there motionless, staring over at her now deceased father. Even though Marie's outward expression showed shock and horror and sadness, inside, Marie felt differently. She was pleased. The night had gone exactly to plan. After Stephen had put that takeout food on the kitchen counter and then stepped into the other room, Marie had rushed over to the kitchen, pulled out a folded-up paper towel from her pocket that contained an odorless, tasteless white powder inside of it, and then Marie quickly sprinkled that powder into the refried beans, something she knew her father would be eating. She stirred it up so he wouldn't notice, and then she grabbed a few untainted tacos for herself, rushed back to the couch, and waited in the other room. When her dad came out a few minutes later, she watched with joy as her dad did exactly what she hoped. He began eating huge quantities of the refried beans. Afterward, he grabbed his jacket, gave Marie a kiss, and headed out the door for church, not realizing he was already a dead man. Marie had poisoned her father, but it would turn out the reason she did it really had nothing to do with Stephen. Instead, it had to do with her mother and her very strict stepfather, Frank. Frank believed it was very important that Marie, whose parents were obviously divorced, pick which biological parent, Beth or Stephen, she wanted to live with. And once that decision was made, he told her it was final. Frank did not want Marie to feel like she could bounce back and forth from one household to the other. She basically needed to commit to one family or the other, and that was it. And Frank told Marie, who was living with Frank and Beth, and so her de facto decision had been to live with them, that if Marie ever moved out to go live with Stephen, then Marie would never be welcome back to live with Beth and Frank. And after Marie caught Frank cheating on her mother, and her mother refused to leave Frank, Marie moved out of the house and in with Stephen. But shortly after moving in with Stephen, Marie had a change of heart and missed her mother terribly and wanted to move back in with her and with Frank. But because of Frank's rule, Frank said no. Marie had been furious and tried to persuade her mother to change Frank's mind and let her come back home and live with them, but her mother continued to stand by Frank and just said, no, you need to stay with your father now. And so this led to all of those yelling fights Marie got into with her mother on the phone that Stephen and Sandra kept overhearing. Marie was absolutely furious and heartbroken, and eventually felt so desperate to find a way to go live with her mom again that she decided the only way was to kill her father, because then her mother and Frank would have to take her back. And so, on February 18th, 1993, Marie poisoned her father's refried beans with a chemical called barium acetate, which is toxic to humans. Marie had stolen the chemical from her chemistry classroom. The reason the coroner had not noticed that Stephen had been poisoned is because in order to detect barium acetate, you basically need to run a special test at a special facility. And the coroner had not thought there was any evidence of foul play, so he had not asked for that test to be run. Marie had gotten away with murder. But nearly a year later, while studying Hamlet, Marie's friend happened to read the part of the play out loud where Hamlet's uncle admits to killing Hamlet's father. And in that moment in the play, Hamlet's uncle realizes he'll never be forgiven because no matter what he does, he will always be a murderer. And when Marie heard those words, "Oh wretched state, oh bosom black as death," she felt a crushing sense of guilt wash over her, and she promptly confessed to her friend what she had done to her father. Marie's friend kept Marie's secret for several months, and during that time, Marie did get to move back in with her mother, until of course she moved out again after catching Frank cheating again, and she moved in with her grandfather, and then shortly after that, Marie's friend did go to police, at which point Marie was arrested. Marie was ultimately found guilty of murder and sentenced to 28 years in prison. However, in 2003, she was granted parole and is believed to still be living in Texas today under a different last name. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, please offer to make the follow button a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but instead of using peanut butter or jelly, just use fermented blobfish. This episode is called Cold Case. On Sunday, September 18th, 1994, Jennifer Thompson went to the county fair for the fourth day in a row. Growing up in the tiny town of Orofino, Idaho, not much usually happened. So 14-year-old Jen wasn't about to waste the most exciting days of the year. Back on Thursday, Jen and her friends had gone on all the rides from the carousel to the Ferris wheel, and then on Friday they went to the county livestock auction, and Saturday was the parade, and now on Sunday they had already watched the log cutting competition, and as they had, they totally gorged themselves on every kind of food the fair had to offer. Corn dogs, funnel cakes, cotton candy, caramel apples, and also all the soda they could drink. Now it was time to go home, and Jen was feeling completely full, like she had just eaten an entire Thanksgiving dinner. Still though, she and her friends each bought one more corn dog for the road, before taking one last walk around the fairgrounds and saying their goodbyes. When Jen got home, her dad Dennis was on the phone, and her mom Sherry was busy making dinner. So Jen just went upstairs to her bedroom. She had a bunch of homework she needed to finish before school on Monday. Jen liked school sports a lot more than school work, but she was in 8th grade now, and she didn't want to fall behind. So she grabbed her math assignments out of her backpack and worked on equations until her mom called her for dinner. Jen made her way downstairs and sat down at the dining room table. Her mom had made one of Jen's favorite meals, chicken and rice casserole. But after all that junk food at the county fair, Jen really didn't have an appetite. So she mostly picked at her plate and told her parents all about her day at the fair, and about how sad she was that it was now over. After dinner, Jen's mom asked Jen if she wanted any dessert, and despite her very full belly, Jen said yes. And so before long, Jen was crushing a big bowl of vanilla ice cream, and then afterwards, she helped her parents clean up before she went back upstairs to her bedroom. Once there, she finished her homework, and then just went to bed early. She wanted to be well rested for school the next day. When Jen's alarm went off in the morning, she dragged herself out of bed and shuffled into the bathroom. But when she turned on the light, a sudden sharp pain shot through her stomach. She doubled over and grabbed the bathroom counter to keep from falling down. For a second, Jen felt like she was about to throw up, but she breathed through the pain, and slowly the cramp sort of went away, Jen released her grip on the counter and straightened up again. She stood for a moment, afraid the pain might come back, but everything seemed okay. Jen told herself that most likely she had just eaten too much at the fair and she was still feeling it today, and so she just went back to getting ready for school. After brushing her teeth, Jen got dressed and slid the math homework from last night into her backpack. Then she zipped up the bag, slung it over one shoulder, and started going downstairs. But about halfway down the steps, another sharp shooting pain cut through Jen's abdomen, and this did not feel like any sort of normal bellyache she had ever had. It felt more like something was trying to tear its way out of her stomach. Jen dropped her backpack and kind of hunched forward, clutching at her stomach. The next thing Jen knew, her mom was at the foot of the stairs, looking up at her with a mixture of confusion and concern on her face. Jen barely had time to tell her mom that she was in pain and feeling sick, before suddenly a big wave of nausea hit her, and she had to run back upstairs to the bathroom, where she vomited and also had diarrhea. A few moments later, Jen's mom, who had gone upstairs as well, knocked softly on the bathroom door and asked Jen if she was okay. Jen called out no and said she felt absolutely horrible. She said something was definitely wrong with her stomach. Through the door, Jen's mother suggested that Jen stay home from school that day. Jen was relieved, but was too nauseous to reply. When Jen's father, Dennis, got home from working at a local car dealership that evening, he went straight upstairs to check on his daughter. Sherry had told him that Jen was having a lot of stomach pain, and both parents agreed that the 4 days of crushing sugar and fried foods at the county fair was very likely responsible for this pain. But when Dennis walked into Jen's bedroom, he was shocked by how miserable she looked. Her face was red and her hair was damp with sweat. Jen told him she'd been throwing up and having diarrhea all day. Her stomach ached when she was lying down, but it hurt even worse when she was standing up. And some of the cramps were so intense, Jen said they made her cry. Dennis brushed a strand of hair out of his daughter's face, then said he was going to get her a glass of water. When he went downstairs, Sherry was waiting in the kitchen, and she would tell him that the only thing Jen had been able to stomach all day was just a few bites of ice cream, and she had been running a low-grade fever for hours. Both parents were very concerned now, but they weren't quite sure what to do. They knew their daughter absolutely hated going to the doctor, and so they agreed that, maybe now was not quite the time to take her yet. For now, Dennis and Sherry decided they would just continue giving their daughter water and Tylenol and check on her throughout the evening. Eventually, despite all her discomfort, Jen would fall asleep, and after she did, Dennis went to bed hopeful that his daughter would feel better soon. 2 days later, on Wednesday morning, Dennis got out of bed and walked upstairs to his daughter's room. But when he went inside, Jen barely stirred. She'd hardly eaten anything for 2 days, but still her stomach cramps had only gotten more painful and more frequent, and she was still running a fever, she was still vomiting, and she was still having diarrhea. Dennis knelt next to his daughter's bed and shook her shoulder until she slowly blinked awake. Then he told his daughter he had bad news. She clearly was not improving, so he and her mother had decided it was time now to go to the doctor. Jen groaned, but she didn't put up a fight, and to Dennis this was actually a bad sign. His daughter was clearly so sick that she wasn't even trying to avoid the doctor. Dennis helped Jen get out of her bed and let her hold onto his arm for stability as they made their way down the stairs and out to the car. Then Dennis backed out of the driveway and headed to their usual family medicine clinic. A few minutes later, Dennis helped Jen climb onto an exam table, and he could tell she was struggling just to sit upright. Before long, Jen's longtime pediatrician, Lyndon Bishop, came into the room, and he was surprised to see his athletic, young patient looking so ill. He listened closely as Dennis explained his daughter's symptoms, and all the while, Jen just silently sat there, clutching her stomach and leaning forward. Dennis told Dr. Bishop that he was pretty sure his daughter had food poisoning from something she must have eaten at the county fair. But when the doctor gave Jen a quick physical examination, he said that he thought Dennis was actually wrong, that this was something else. Because he said, food poisoning usually only lasts for 1 to 2 days, and Jen had been in pain for over 3 days. And so Dennis was taken aback by this, but he understood the logic. Dr. Bishop asked Jen if she had any history of stomach pain. Her father was about to answer for her, but then Jen lifted her head up and said yes in a weak voice. But that was all she could manage to say before she had to slump forward again. At this point, Dennis stepped in and he explained that not long ago, Jen had suffered from debilitating cramps in her lower abdomen for seemingly no obvious reason. Dennis and Sherry had taken their daughter to a gynecologist who found that one of Jen's ovaries was swollen to 3 times its normal size. Fortunately, this swelling was not cancerous, and eventually Jen's cramps had just kind of gone away on their own. Dennis admitted that, when Jen first got sick after the county fair, he didn't even think about her swollen ovary because her illness was so much worse this time. He didn't think a swollen ovary could give his daughter symptoms like a fever, diarrhea, and vomiting. But Dr. Bishop said he did think it was possible. Maybe Jen was ovulating, and that caused the swelling to return, and her symptoms came back even worse than before. It was the best and really only theory they had for now. So Jen was ultimately sent home with strict instructions to come back if the pain got any worse. Dennis was disappointed there wasn't more they could do for the moment, but he trusted Dr. Bishop's judgment, so he helped Jen off the exam table and walked her back out to the car. He leaned the passenger seat all the way back so Jen could lie down, and then as they drove home, Jen curled into the fetal position and began moaning. It made Dennis feel terrible to see his daughter suffer so badly when he really couldn't do anything to help her. But he reminded himself what Dr. Bishop had said right before they left. Don't worry, Jen will feel better soon. Later that evening, Dennis tucked his shivering daughter into bed. Sherry had gone out of town to visit the couple's other daughter. Dennis was going to be holding down the fort by himself along with Jen, and so far everything seemed to be okay. At least Jen was resting. Dennis put on his pajamas, brushed his teeth, and climbed into bed to watch TV, but as soon as he turned it on, he heard his daughter screaming, so he jumped out of bed and sprinted to Jen's room. When he got there, he found his daughter lying on the floor, curled up into a ball with tears streaming down her face. Jen kept screaming that she'd never felt anything that hurt this badly. She said she literally felt like she was going to die. In a total panic, Dennis ran back downstairs to the living room, he grabbed the phone and called the nearest emergency room. A receptionist answered and patched him through to a nurse, and Dennis explained what was happening, and the nurse paged Dr. Bishop, and he responded immediately, saying, "You know what? It sounds like Jen has appendicitis." The nurse told Dennis to bring his daughter to the emergency room immediately. In severe appendicitis cases, the appendix can burst open inside the body, causing complications and even death. And so if Jen had acute appendicitis, then she would need surgery to remove her appendix as soon as possible. By the time they made it to the hospital about 20 minutes later, Jen was barely coherent. Dennis lifted her out of the passenger seat and carried her into the emergency room. Under the bright fluorescent lights, he could see that his daughter's face was bright red and drenched in sweat. As soon as Dennis approached the check-in desk with his daughter in his arms, the receptionist called for the nurse who he'd spoken to on the phone. Within moments, the nurse and other members of the hospital staff loaded Jen onto a gurney, and Dennis followed as they wheeled his daughter into a nearby exam room. The nurse began taking Jen's vital signs and saw that she had a fever, she was severely dehydrated, and her pulse was distressingly high. The nurse began to explain to Dennis what his daughter's vital signs could mean, but then a short man wearing glasses and a white coat entered the room. He introduced himself as Dr. Maurice Mazer, and he'd already been briefed up on Jen's condition, so he went straight to her bedside and began examining her. He began to press lightly on the lower right-hand side of Jen's abdomen to check her appendix. The doctor's prodding seemed to wake Jen up, and she began to cry out in pain and tried to push the doctor away. Dr. Mazer said that it did look like Jen had appendicitis. This would explain her extreme abdominal pain, her fever, and her confusion. The doctor said the only treatment was an emergency operation to remove her appendix, like right now. But as Dr. Mazer reviewed Jen's medical charts, he told her father that something didn't look right to him. Jen's white blood cell count, her body's natural defense, was going down. The doctor said the number of those cells should be soaring right now as Jen's body fought off this appendicitis. Dr. Mazer said the drop could mean two things. Either her infection was getting better, which seemed very unlikely based on how sick Jen still appeared, or her appendicitis was getting so severe that it was overwhelming her natural defenses. And so Dr. Mazur told Dennis that bottom line, he believed Jen's appendix needed to be removed immediately. Otherwise, his daughter's life could be in danger. Dennis looked at Jen, who looked absolutely terrified. Tears filled her eyes as she said she didn't want to have surgery. But all Dennis could do was promise her that she would feel better when it was all over. And then he gave his daughter a gentle hug before the nurses took her away to be prepped for surgery. Jen's mother, Sherry, returned from visiting her other daughter just in time to find Dennis sitting in the hospital waiting room. The couple spent the next hour waiting on the edge of their seats until finally Dr. Mazur entered the waiting room and sat down beside them. Right away, the doctor said Jen's surgery had gone smoothly and she was okay, but then Dr. Mazur frowned. He explained that while Jen's appendix did show modest signs of infection, it wasn't nearly bad enough to cause the agony she had been going through. The parents were confused. Their daughter had been rushed into emergency surgery to remove her appendix, but now that that was done, it sounded like it might not have been necessary. But Dr. Mazur, who was sensing this in the parents, assured them that they'd actually done the right thing, because during the course of this operation, Dr. Mazur had discovered something very unsettling about Jen. Jen's whole intestinal tract looked red and inflamed, and Dr. Mazur didn't know why. And so, in short, because of this operation, it was discovered that Jen's appendix was not badly infected. However, the rest of her digestive system was. And so Dr. Mazur said he hoped Jen would feel better now that her appendix was out, but he just wasn't sure if that had really done anything to fix the issue. Dennis and Sherry turned to each other in amazement. Neither of them were comforted by the idea that Jen might or might not feel better. It sounded like she had a dangerous infection that the surgery hadn't really touched. But there was nothing they could do about that now, so Dennis grabbed a magazine off the waiting room table and began to read, doing his best to distract himself until he could see his daughter again. "1,200 miles away at that very moment, a different and yet eerily similar story was playing out in rural Minnesota. A young nurse named Callie Vins was working in a small local medical clinic, and it was totally packed. Normally, it was not her job to check patients in, but there were so many people crammed into the small waiting room that the receptionist needed Callie's help. Callie pushed her short dark hair out of her face, feeling totally overwhelmed. She was an experienced and highly capable nurse, but the past few days had really pushed her to her limit. Dozens of teenagers had come into the clinic with fevers, diarrhea, vomiting, and extreme stomach pains. One of the doctors who worked at this clinic thought the teenagers had the flu, but to Callie, that didn't make any sense. For starters, if this was the flu, then why were only teenagers getting sick? Why not their parents or younger siblings? And why didn't they have runny noses, coughs, or any of the other respiratory symptoms typically associated with the flu? Callie heard the bell above the front door ring as yet another nauseous teenager and their parents stepped inside. Looking around at the waiting room full of sick kids, Callie knew she needed to do something. Whatever was going on here, she did not believe their small clinic was equipped to handle it. Callie turned and told the receptionist that she'd be right back. Then Callie made her way through the crowd of people and into the back of the clinic. At the nurse's station, she pulled out the office phone book and found the number for the Minnesota Department of Health. As soon as a representative answered her call, Callie described the mysterious outbreak in her small rural town. The representative told Callie to collect saliva, urine, and stool samples from all the patients and send them in to the health department for testing. This way, state analysts could try to figure out what was causing this widespread illness. Callie thanked the official and then hung up the phone. As one of the clinic's doctors rushed past her on the way to visit yet another patient, Callie pulled them aside and explained what they needed to do. A couple days later, 14-year-old Jen Thompson was back at home in Orofino, Idaho, lying on the living room couch and watching TV. She'd been released from the hospital, but so far, recovering from her appendectomy had been very difficult. The incision on her lower abdomen was always itchy, her stomach ached constantly, and she could barely keep food down. Plus, on top of that, she'd never been so bored in her life. It had only been a little over a week since she got sick, but she already just felt so isolated. She missed going to softball practice and spending time with her friends. She even missed school, which was something she never thought she'd say. Jen picked up the TV remote and began flipping through the channels trying to find something she wanted to watch. But then suddenly this sharp, totally overwhelming pain filled her stomach, and it was so intense it made her drop the remote. The pain she was having felt just like the cramps she had had before her surgery. Jen's bottom lip started to tremble. She called out for her dad, and a second later, Dennis rushed into the room. Jen was in so much pain she could barely breathe, let alone talk. But as soon as Dennis walked into the room, she really didn't have to explain anything to him. He could see clearly how much pain his daughter was in, and so a second later he had ran out of the room, got Jen's mother, and got the car keys, and then within minutes, the entire Thompson family was back on the road, heading to the hospital. Less than an hour later, Jen was lying on a hospital bed with Dr. Mazur standing over her. Dr. Mazur pressed lightly on Jen's abdomen and said her incisions seemed to be healing fine. But clearly, something other than appendicitis was making her sick. Dr. Mazur said he was beginning to wonder if maybe Jen was suffering from an infection that was inside of her intestines. So he ordered a stool sample to be tested for a number of different bacteria. The idea of foreign bacteria inside her digestive tract really freaked Jen out, but it wasn't nearly as bad as what Dr. Mazur said next. Bacterial testing would likely take at least 24 hours to complete, and he didn't think they had any time to waste. Dr. Mazur was worried that he'd missed something along the way, so he suggested an exploratory surgery to see if he might be able to determine the source of her illness. Jen had already gone through one surgery, and the idea of being cut open again was almost too much for her to handle. She looked at her parents, wishing they could save her from this. Her mother looked like she was about to cry, while her father was just shaking his head back and forth. But Dennis told the doctor that if another surgery was what they had to do, then that's what they had to do. And deep down, even though Jen did not want to do this surgery, she knew he was right. So, despite Jen's deep anxieties, nurses began prepping her for the operation. They hooked her up to an IV and then cleaned the skin on her belly where the scalpel would cut her open. All the while, Jen felt like she was going to throw up, both from nerves and also from her illness. But just as the nurses were about to wheel Jen back into the operating room, Dr. Mazur came running into the room saying the surgery would not be necessary after all. The hospital lab was not very busy that day, so they'd been able to expedite the stool sample tests, and now he knew the source of Jen's illness. It would turn out Jen's illness was not from her enlarged ovary or from appendicitis. The doctor said she had a potentially deadly microorganism living inside her digestive tract. Now, it most likely came from something she ate, but the doctor said he had no idea what that could be. However, on the positive side, Dr. Mazur said that, while this microorganism was very dangerous, there was a very effective treatment that they could begin right away. As Jen's treatment began, 3 states away, a man named Larry Edmondson was standing in his office at the Minnesota Department of Health, staring at a large map that he'd taped up on his wall. It was a detailed picture of the state of Minnesota, and Larry had stuck a number of red thumbtacks into the map to mark different locations. Larry was leading the investigation into the mysterious disease outbreak in his state. After nurse Callie Vins had called the Minnesota Health Department, Larry and his team had received dozens of biological samples from patients at Callie's clinic. They tested each one, and they too discovered the source of the outbreak. It was the same microorganism that infected Jen in Idaho. But Larry didn't know about Jen. He thought the microorganism was only in Minnesota, and right now he was trying to figure out exactly where it came from. The Minnesota Health Department had continued receiving calls from medical clinics across the state, reporting patients with similar symptoms. Every time Larry got a call, he would send a representative to interview the sick patient and also to collect samples of anything they'd eaten recently. Then Larry put a red thumbtack on the patient's location on the map. He had hoped these red thumbtacks would be more concentrated in one particular area, allowing him to sort of pinpoint the origin of the disease outbreak. But the thumbtacks were spread out in a way that looked totally random. Larry didn't know what to make of this, but he knew that with each passing day, more people were getting sick. While Larry Edmondson puzzled over the Minnesota outbreak, representatives from the Idaho Health Department were digging through Jen Thompson's kitchen. As they did, Jen watched them from her spot on the living room couch. It had been just one day since Dr. Mazur diagnosed Jen, and she was already feeling much better. Dr. Mazur prescribed some antibiotics that were working well, and for the first time in over a week, Jen didn't feel nauseous. She could finally keep food down, but she was scared to eat anything that came from inside her house, because it might contain the deadly microorganism. Jen looked on as the employees pulled fruit, vegetables, cheeses, and meats out of the refrigerator. They took small samples of each item and sealed them inside of small labeled baggies. Jen heard them tell her parents that they would test the samples and let them know the results as soon as possible. Dennis and Sherry thanked them, and then the employees left. As soon as they were gone, Jen's dad walked into the kitchen and took all the food out of the fridge and out of the freezer and just dumped it into a trash bag, went into the backyard, and threw it away. When he came back inside, he told Jen they'd just go grocery shopping for new food tomorrow. That way they would know for sure that whatever they bought was safe to eat. At the Minnesota Health Department, Larry Edmondson had collected hundreds of food samples from the homes of people who had gotten sick. Now, microbiologists were hard at work testing those samples to determine which, if any, contained the deadly microorganism causing all the illness. Larry entered the lab to find two analysts staring down at a line of petri dishes. They looked up when they heard him come in, and he asked them for an update on their progress. And one of the analysts said that Larry's timing actually couldn't be any better, because they had just found something he needed to see. Larry immediately rushed over to them to see what they were talking about. He knew that each of these petri dishes contained a swab from the food samples that the health department had collected. The lab analysts were watching all of them for signs of this microorganism, and all of these samples currently looked normal, except for one, which had grown a whole bunch of small black circles all over the sample. Larry's eyes widened when he saw it, because those black circles were a telltale sign of this deadly microorganism. He asked the analysts which food that sample came from, and they said it was from ice cream. Larry quickly reviewed the records from his investigation, and the truth dawned on him. Every person who had fallen ill had recently eaten ice cream from a company called Schwann's. And now the health department had proof that this ice cream contained this deadly microorganism. Larry almost wanted to cheer, but he reminded himself that this was not really a time to celebrate. He was sure that the company Schwann's had no idea their ice cream was poisoning people, so Larry would have to call them right away. A few days later, Larry sat in his office at the Minnesota Health Department feeling very frustrated. This case just kept getting more difficult. When Larry had called the ice cream company Schwann's, he learned something very concerning. Schwann's ice cream was not typically sold in grocery stores. Instead, it was delivered directly to customers' doors all across the United States. Now, Larry still knew nothing about 14-year-old Jen Thompson's severe illness out in Idaho, but he now understood that this disease outbreak likely went far beyond Minnesota. On the bright side, though, Schwann's had been extremely cooperative. As soon as they learned their ice cream was tainted, they shut down their factory and recalled all of the potentially contaminated products. Schwann's delivery drivers were going door to door across the nation, informing customers of this outbreak and collecting tainted ice cream. But the Minnesota Health Department still hadn't figured out how the microorganism got into the ice cream in the first place. And that was the only way to prevent this disaster from happening again. Larry read over a report from one of his colleagues. They had swabbed miles of stainless steel piping at the company's giant manufacturing plant, but none contained any trace of this microorganism that sickened all the teens. So where was it coming from? Minnesota officials had expanded their investigation to include the company's distribution system, and so Larry's coworkers were now analyzing the company's trucks, trying to see if maybe the product was contaminated during shipping. Just then, Larry's phone rang, and he picked it up, hoping it would be one of his colleagues with good news. But it wasn't. When Larry answered, he heard a man's nervous voice, and this man said he had a tip about the department's ongoing food safety investigation, but this man was calling from a payphone because he wanted to stay anonymous. When Larry heard this, he sat upright, pressing the phone hard against his ear. He told the man that was fine. Larry didn't need his name, he just needed whatever information he had. So the man whispered that he was a truck driver, and the company he worked for shipped two kinds of cargo: bulk ice cream for Schwann's and unpasteurized liquid eggs. The driver said that the same trucks could carry liquid eggs one day and ice cream the next. And then in between, the refrigerated cargo tanks on the back of the trucks were supposed to be thoroughly cleaned so that there was no contamination from one load to the next. But the tipster said one driver had not been given the right cleaning supplies to disinfect their vehicle after hauling thousands of gallons of liquid eggs. So bacteria from the unpasteurized eggs contaminated the entire truck. And so as soon as the Schwann's ice cream was loaded into that truck, the ice cream got contaminated. Larry thanked the driver for coming forward. Because of him, the Minnesota Health Department could finally close this case. Larry immediately went to his supervisors and told them the whole story. When that cargo truck wasn't cleaned properly, it turned into a giant incubator for a type of deadly bacteria found in unpasteurized eggs, called salmonella. The salmonella bacteria then mixed with a giant shipment of Schwann's vanilla ice cream. And so after 14-year-old Jen Thompson got home from the county fair on Sunday, February 18th, 1994, she did her math homework, she ate her dinner, then right before bed, she ate a bowl of the contaminated Schwann's vanilla ice cream. And so, of course, she and her parents had no idea that her dessert was full of salmonella bacteria. And so as a result, Jen just kept eating more and more of this contaminated ice cream each time she felt sick, because it was really the only food she could actually stomach. And so as this bacteria continued to multiply inside of her body, she got sicker and sicker. Jen and her family had no idea the ice cream was behind her illness until sometime in mid-October, when a Schwann's delivery driver came to their door and asked to take the contaminated ice cream back. The Schwann's salmonella contamination was one of the biggest mass poisonings in American history. In total, there were 593 confirmed cases of salmonella poisoning across 41 states and as many as 5,000 suspected cases nationwide. However, some experts estimate that there may have been nearly 225,000 people who got sick from this tainted ice cream. They just didn't report it. The ice cream company, Schwann's, paid out thousands of settlements to victims and changed their shipping procedure to make sure this contamination could never happen again. As for why the illness predominantly struck teenagers, it was likely due to two factors. One, young people tend to eat more ice cream, and two, young people tend to be more shy or embarrassed to talk about gastrointestinal issues than their more senior counterparts. And so as a result, maybe they began having symptoms and could have gone to the doctor and dealt with them, but in fear of being embarrassed, they didn't go to the doctor and let this condition get worse and worse and worse, and then finally it turned into a full-blown emergency room visit. But very few of the people who got salmonella poisoning had symptoms as severe as 14-year-old Jen Thompson. Even after having her appendix removed, she had to undergo at least 3 more surgeries to fix her damaged digestive system, including having her gallbladder taken out. The salmonella also caused her to develop a rare type of arthritis. To this day, Jen still lives with chronic pain, all because of a few bowls of ice cream she ate back in 1994. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Karis Allen Pash Cooper. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Our managing producer is Sophia Martins, and our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Tasia Peliconda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matav Zair. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive